Rock and roll built itself on borrowed riffs, borrowed rhythms, and borrowed ideas. But borrowing without permission has a name, and courts have been happy to put a price on it. These are the 13 bands from 60s and 70s that got destroyed for stealing songs. Number 13. The Beach Boys, Surfin' USA, 1963. In 1958, Chuck Berry released Sweet Little 16. 5 years later, the Beach Boys released Surfin' USA, which used the same melody, the same chord structure, and a nearly identical rhythm, with only the lyrics rewritten to fit a surfing theme. Berry's song had rattled off the names of American cities where teenagers danced. Wilson's version did the same with surfing spots along the Pacific coast. The template was identical. Bushy blonde hair, surfing you. Brian Wilson later said he intended it as a tribute to Berry. His lawyers called it something else. The Beach Boys had been performing Berry songs in their live sets for years and knew his catalog well. Whether that made the borrowing more calculated or simply more unconscious was beside the point. The melody wasn't theirs to use. Surfing USA. Berry's publisher, Arc Music, threatened legal action. The Beach Boys manager Murray Wilson, Brian's father, quickly stepped in to avoid a courtroom fight. He handed over the publishing rights to Arc Music on Berry's behalf. The song remained a major hit, and the Beach Boys didn't face a formal trial. But Chuck Berry's name didn't appear on the songwriting credits until 1966. For 3 years, a song he had effectively written was being sold under someone else's name. It was one of the first high-profile copyright disputes between two major recording acts of the rock era, and it established an early precedent that the decade following would test repeatedly. The melody of a song is protected property, and changing the words around it doesn't make it yours. Number 12. The Rolling Stones, The Last Time, 1965. Well, this could be the last time. The Last Time was the Rolling Stones' first UK number 1, credited entirely to Jagger and Richards as songwriters. That was significant at the time. The band had been heavily dependent on covers, and this felt like a genuine turning point into original material. It reached number 1 in the UK in February 1965 and peaked at number 9 in the United States. The problem was that the song's chorus was nearly identical, both in melody and lyrics, to "This May Be the Last Time," recorded by the Staple Singers in 1954. The Staple Singers version was itself rooted in an even older gospel tradition, a sermon recorded by Reverend J.M. Gates in 1926 under the title, "You May Be Alive, You May Be Dead, Christmas Day." The chain of inheritance ran deep, which complicated any potential legal action. Keith Richards later acknowledged in interviews that he was familiar with the Staple Singers recording and considered the gospel tradition common ground. He described the song as drawing from a shared musical vocabulary rather than being a direct lift. But the similarities in the chorus were not abstract. They were specific enough that anyone familiar with both recordings would hear them immediately. This could be the last time. This could be the... No legal action was ultimately taken against the Stones over this specific song. The fact that the Staple Singers version had its own roots in uncopyrighted gospel material made the legal pathway difficult for any plaintiff to navigate. But the episode is a clear reminder that in 1965, the lines between inspiration, cultural inheritance, and outright borrowing were being drawn in real time. And some of the biggest names in British rock were standing right on top of them. Well, this could be the last time. Number 11. The Beatles, Come Together, 1969. Come together. John Lennon acknowledged from the outset that Come Together was built in part on Chuck Berry's 1956 recording, You Can't Catch Me. He even borrowed a line from it directly, an opening phrase that Berry had used and that Lennon incorporated into the new song's structure. Lennon's intent was to transform it into something completely different in feel and meaning, and in many ways he succeeded. But Morris Levy, the publisher who owned the rights to the Berry song through Big Seven Music, was not persuaded by the artistic intent. Levy filed a lawsuit against Lennon and Apple Records not long after Come Together was released as part of the Beatles' Abbey Road album in September 1969. The case was settled out of court in October 1973. As part of the agreement, Lennon promised to record 3 songs from Big Seven's catalog on his next album. That agreement opened the door to one of the stranger episodes in Lennon's solo career. While he was recording the material he owed Big Seven, Levy obtained an unauthorized copy of the sessions and released them through a mail order company under the title Roots. John Lennon sings the great rock and roll hits. Lennon's official album Rock and Roll came out shortly after on Capitol Records, and Lennon sued Levy for the unauthorized release. A court ruled in Lennon's favor and awarded him $144,700 in damages. The original lawsuit over Come Together was the seed of all of it, resolved without a verdict, but setting off a chain of events that dragged through the mid-1970s and cost everyone involved time, money, and energy. Come together right now. Number 10. The Doors. Hello, I Love You, 1968. The Doors first put Hello, I Love You on a demo in 1965, long before they had a record deal. By 1968, when they needed material for their third album Waiting for the Sun, they pulled it back out. The song went to number 1 in the United States and gave the Doors their second and final chart topper. Shortly after, the Kinks publisher took notice of how closely the central riff tracked with the Kinks' 1964 track All Day and All of the Night, written by Ray Davies. Ray Davies later said his publisher pushed to take legal action. Davies himself was reluctant to sue. He expressed in later interviews that he found the similarities irritating rather than personally offensive. He was also aware that confronting a band at the height of their fame over a guitar riff carried its own complications. In the end, a deal was reached quietly, and the Doors paid royalties from the British single to the Kinks publisher. The settlement was handled without much public attention. It didn't generate the kind of headlines that later copyright battles would. But the money changed hands, and the matter was considered resolved. Robbie Krieger, the Doors guitarist, denied intentional copying and maintained the riff was independently conceived. Jim Morrison later admitted the song had been heavily influenced by the Kinks. Ray Davies ultimately said Morrison's public admission was enough acknowledgement for him personally, though the financial settlement had already been made by that point. I love you, let me jump in your game. Number 9. George Harrison, My Sweet Lord, 1970. My sweet Lord. George Harrison became the first former Beatle to top the charts with a solo single when My Sweet Lord reached number 1 in 1970. It was a spiritual song, earnest and widely loved. It was also, according to the courts, the same song as He's So Fine, a 1963 hit written by Ronnie Mack and recorded by the Chiffons. Bright Tunes Music Corporation filed a lawsuit in 1971. The case didn't go to trial until February 1976, by which point Mack had already died, and Bright Tunes was primarily a business entity pursuing the copyright claim. Judge Richard Owen ruled that Harrison had engaged in what he called unconscious plagiarism. He had absorbed the melody without realizing it had lodged in his memory. The court awarded Bright Tunes $1,599,987, later reduced to $587,000. Harrison paid. He later wrote a song called This Song in response to the case, which commented on the lawsuit with dry humor. But the legal case itself dragged on for years and set a lasting precedent. Not knowing you copied something is not a defense. My sweet Lord, Number 8. Led Zeppelin, Whole Lotta Love, 1969. Willie Dixon was one of the most important songwriters in the history of American blues. He wrote songs that defined the Chess Records catalog in the 1950s and 1960s. And many of those songs became foundational texts for British rock bands who grew up listening to American blues imports. Led Zeppelin was at the top of that list. They had covered Dixon's compositions legitimately on their debut album and credited him properly. What happened on the second album was a different matter. Whole Lotta Love from Led Zeppelin II drew heavily from Dixon's 1962 song You Need Love, written for Muddy Waters and also covered by The Small Faces in 1966 under the title You Need Loving. Robert Plant later admitted the lyrics were, in his words, a nick. He said Jimmy Page's riff was entirely original, but the vocal lines and phrasing came from Dixon's song. He described it as a decision made in the moment, without fully reckoning with the consequences. "What am I going to sing?" was how Plant put it. He took Dixon's words. Dixon filed a lawsuit against Led Zeppelin in January 1985, 16 years after the song was released. The case was settled out of court in 1987. Dixon received credit and financial compensation. His name did not begin appearing on the song's published credits until 1999, 12 years after the settlement. By then, the song had been generating royalties for 3 decades, almost none of which had gone to the man who wrote its most memorable lines. Number 7. Led Zeppelin, Bring It On Home, 1969. The same year Whole Lotta Love appeared, Led Zeppelin released Bring It On Home on the same album, Led Zeppelin II. The song's opening and closing sections were taken almost directly from a Willie Dixon composition of the same name, originally recorded by Sonny Boy Williamson for Chess Records. The middle section of Zeppelin's version was a different piece of music entirely, an original hard rock instrumental, but the bookended intro and outro bore an unmistakable resemblance to Williamson's recording. Arc Music, which controlled the publishing rights to the original, eventually filed a lawsuit. Dixon himself noted in his memoir that Chess's own publishing arm had initially failed to catch the similarity and monitor the situation, which meant several years passed before anyone formally pursued the matter. When the lawsuit was filed, it was settled out of court. Subsequent releases of the song began listing Willie Dixon as co-author, and Zeppelin paid an undisclosed sum in damages. It was the second major lawsuit they faced, tied to the same Chess Records catalog and the same songwriter in a very short period of time. The legal bills were mounting, but the reputational cost was perhaps larger. With each settlement, the picture of how the band had built some of their most celebrated music became harder to look away from. Number 6. Led Zeppelin, The Lemon Song, 1969. The Lemon Song appeared on Led Zeppelin II and drew from Howlin' Wolf's 1964 recording Killing Floor. The riff and key lyrical elements were close enough that Arc Music, the same publishing company that handled Howlin' Wolf's material, sued Led Zeppelin in 1972. The case was settled out of court, and Howlin' Wolf was given a co-writing credit on all subsequent releases of the track. Howlin' Wolf, born Chester Arthur Burnett, was one of the most commanding figures in electric blues. He had recorded Killing Floor 8 years before Led Zeppelin released their version under a different name. The lawsuit came 2 years after the album's release, and the settlement meant Wolf received royalties before his death in 1976. The string of lawsuits, Whole Lotta Love, Bring It On Home, and now The Lemon Song, all filed within a few years of each other, began to define Led Zeppelin's legal record as clearly as their musical one. Number 5. Led Zeppelin, Stairway to Heaven, 1971. Stairway to Heaven is arguably the most famous rock song ever recorded. It is also the subject of one of the most expensive and closely watched copyright disputes in music history. In 2014, the estate of Randy Wolf, the guitarist for the 1960s band Spirit, who performed under the name Randy California, filed a lawsuit claiming that the iconic opening guitar sequence was taken from Spirit's 1968 instrumental Taurus. The two bands had shared billing during Led Zeppelin's first U.S. tour in 1968 and 1969. Spirit had already recorded and performed Taurus by the time Zeppelin joined that tour. Jimmy Page maintained he had no memory of the song. Robert Plant testified as well. The case went through multiple rounds in the federal courts. A jury ruled in Led Zeppelin's favor in 2016. That verdict was overturned on appeal in 2018, leading to a second trial. In 2020, following a retrial, Led Zeppelin won again, and the Supreme Court declined to hear the case, leaving that ruling in place. The legal fight spanned 6 years and cost enormous amounts in legal fees on both sides, all without a single dollar changing hands in damages. Number 4. Creedence Clearwater Revival, Run Through the Jungle, 1970. The case involving Run Through the Jungle is one of the stranger stories in music copyright history, because the songwriter accused of stealing was accused of stealing from himself. When Creedence Clearwater Revival broke up in 1972, the band's record label, Fantasy Records, retained the rights to their catalog. John Fogerty had signed away those rights as part of his original contract, a deal he later described as one of the most damaging decisions of his career. When CCR was at its commercial peak between 1969 and 1971, the band had been one of the top-selling acts in the United States. They sold out stadiums, released multiple hit singles per year, and made enormous amounts of money for Fantasy Records. Fogerty's relationship with label owner Saul Zaentz deteriorated after the breakup, and by the mid-1980s, it had turned openly hostile. Fogerty released a solo album called Centerfield in 1985, and Zaentz filed a copyright infringement lawsuit claiming that the lead single, The Old Man Down the Road, was essentially a rewrite of Run Through the Jungle, a song Fogerty had written and recorded with CCR 15 years earlier. The argument was that Fogerty had effectively stolen from Fantasy by recreating a sound they now owned the rights to. The case went to trial. Fogerty brought his guitar into the witness stand and demonstrated to the jury that the two songs, while sharing a stylistic feel rooted in his distinctive swamp rock sound, were genuinely different compositions. The judge ruled in his favor in 1994, with the legal principle that a songwriter cannot plagiarize themselves. Fogerty then countersued Zaentz to recover his legal costs. That case went all the way to the Supreme Court before Fogerty prevailed and was awarded attorney's fees for both proceedings. Number 3. The Bee Gees, How Deep Is Your Love, 1977. The Bee Gees released How Deep Is Your Love as part of the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack in 1977, and it reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and stayed there for 3 weeks. It was one of the most heard songs of the decade. 6 years later, a Chicago songwriter named Ronald Sell filed a lawsuit claiming the song's melody was taken from his 1975 demo, Let It End. Sell said he had submitted the demo to several music publishers in New York around the time the Bee Gees were recording. The case went to trial, and the jury initially found in favor of Sell. It was a result that stunned the music industry, a verdict against one of the biggest bands in the world over a song that had become one of the defining recordings of the decade, handed down in favor of a songwriter that almost no one had heard of. The Bee Gees appealed, and the judge ultimately granted them a judgment notwithstanding the verdict, overturning the jury's decision. The ruling hinged on the finding that there was no credible evidence the Bee Gees had ever had access to Sell's unpublished demo. The publishers Sell had submitted the recording to had no verified connection to the Bee Gees or their producer. The case became a landmark in copyright law, establishing the critical role that access plays in infringement claims. Similarity between two works is not by itself enough to prove copying. There must also be a reasonable basis to believe the accused party ever encountered the original. That principle has shaped how copyright disputes are argued in music courts ever since. Number 2. Rod Stewart, Do Ya Think I'm Sexy, 1978. Rod Stewart released Do Ya Think I'm Sexy in late 1978, and it topped the charts in both the United States and the United Kingdom, spending 4 weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It was his biggest commercial hit to that point, and it signaled his full embrace of the disco era. Then Brazilian musician Jorge Ben-Jor filed a copyright infringement lawsuit, claiming the chorus of Stewart's song had been taken from his 1972 track Taj Mahal. Stewart did not fight it. He admitted in interviews at the time, and later confirmed in his 2012 autobiography, Rod, The Autobiography, that he had heard Ben-Jor play the song at the 1978 Rio Carnival earlier that year, that the melody had lodged itself somewhere in his memory without him consciously registering it, and that it later emerged when he was writing in the studio. He didn't try to minimize the incident. He called it unconscious plagiarism, plain and simple. The lawsuit was settled out of court in Ben-Jor's favor. As part of the resolution, Stewart reportedly agreed to donate all of the royalties from the song to UNICEF, an outcome that was reported as part of a performance Stewart gave at a UNICEF concert in January 1979. Ben-Jor described the settlement as amicable. The financial outcome was unusual. One of the year's biggest hit songs generated no income for its credited writer because he had, by his own admission, borrowed too much of it from someone else. Number 1. George Harrison, My Sweet Lord. Revisited, The Larger Cost. The case that had perhaps the most lasting impact on how the music industry thought about copyright wasn't a battle between two artists disputing credit. It was a ruling that changed the legal framework for every musician who followed. When Judge Richard Owen declared that George Harrison had unconsciously copied He's So Fine to create My Sweet Lord, he established in U.S. law that intent is irrelevant to copyright infringement. It didn't matter that Harrison hadn't sat down to plagiarize the chiffon song. It didn't matter that he genuinely believed the melody was his own. The courts found that he had absorbed it and reproduced it, and that was enough. The financial judgment was only part of what made this case historic. The ABKCO Company, which had purchased the rights to He's So Fine during the course of the lawsuit, eventually tried to acquire the song rights to My Sweet Lord as well. This meant Harrison faced the surreal prospect of having to buy back ownership of his own song. The legal entanglement continued into the early 1990s before being fully resolved. Every musician working since 1976 has understood, because of this case, that a song absorbed in childhood, heard once in passing, or lodged in the subconscious without the writer's awareness, can still cost them in court. That has changed how songwriters work, how publishers operate, and how copyright law is applied to creative music. And it all started with a spiritual song by a former Beatle that sounded too much like a girl group hit from 1963. The 60s and 70s built some of the most enduring music ever recorded, but they also built the courtrooms that have been arguing over it ever since. If this brought back some memories, let us know in the comments. Which case surprised you most? And if you want more stories like this, hit like and subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.